I think we're almost close to getting the max of the storage.
Okay. I'll let everybody in because it's punctuality is important.
Let's do it.
Okay.
All right. Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
As always, we've got a few seconds while Zoom slowly lets people in, and I'm expecting a few stragglers to come in as well, as everyone likes to join webinars, you know, a minute late. It happens. Other things run over. While we are waiting to get started, this is the non-dilutive funding webinar portion of the Restart and Resiliency program from Foresight. So I hope all of you are in the right place. And a quick question while we're waiting for the last few people to come in here. Who here is attending because they think they're going to be applying for grants in the next 1 to 3 months? And just go in the chat there and just tell us whether your interest is because you've currently got grant applications outstanding, you've got grant applications that you're targeting in the next couple months, or just generally in the future you think granting might help with your funding. With that overwhelming response of interest, there we go. Thank you, Allison. Nothing specific at this point. Okay, well, this is good. It'll give Stephanie some, she'll be talking about some specific things you could, you should have already applied for, as well as giving some tips on general future things to look for when applying for grants. So as I mentioned, this is the non-dilutive funding webinar from Foresight's Restart and Resiliency program. Stephanie, if you could just advance the slide.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be I'll be doing some introductions of our speakers. We'll move into a little presentation from Stephanie, as I mentioned, about granting or non-dilutive funding options that you can and should be looking at. Then we'll be turning over to someone who has had wonderful experience in this field in the industry. And then we will be moving to some question and answer from you guys. Some housekeeping issues. We will be recording this session. We'll be making it available online should you wish to share it with any of your colleagues or other companies you know that may benefit from the information, or you want to refer to it later. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we can either keep them for the end, or should they be really topical and Stephanie stops to take a breath, I may jump in and ask her at that time or later on when we're talking to Steve Slater. So feel free to jump in on the chat box and make any comments you like there. I will be monitoring that. And with that, I will move on. If you can move to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
As I've alluded to already, Stephanie Sang will be giving our presentation on non-dilutive funding. Why have we chosen her? Because this is what she specializes in. She's the CEO at Granted Consulting. They help small and medium enterprises locate the grants that will work for their organizations, specifically around mostly employment, but generally as well. And so she does this day in, day out. And I think you recently mentioned to me that over the last few years, you've helped companies access $35 million in non-dilutive funding.
Yep.
So she's certainly a well-versed expert in the field. And as well, since the start of COVID, Stephanie has stepped in to contribute to solutions for people with your masks for work. So designing and developing a specialty fabric that's more breathable while still offering solution and hopefully being comfortable. I haven't gotten my sample yet. I'm waiting for it, but just teasing Stephanie. There's also available in kid sizes. So if you're looking for masks around for your workforce, for yourself, for your kids even going back to school, that's a great little side business. And we love people who have pivoted in response to the current new normal and looked and found opportunities. And I think that's something we certainly encourage all of the companies that we work with at Foresight to look for how they can provide solutions to the current challenges being faced.
Yeah.
Stephanie, if you want to roll to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
I'm quite thankful and really excited to have Steve Slater joining us as well. He's the VP of Strategic Innovations at Terramera. Steve has a wealth of experience. He has a PhD in molecular biology. He did some postdoctoral work at a little institution you might have heard of, I think, Harvard. And he's obviously been an entrepreneur. He's founded Winogen. He's worked as a senior executive. He's been the VP of research at a major university, at a major company, and is now heading up work at Terramera. And they've had great success with their granting approaches. So it's wonderful to have him today here to share some of what's worked for him and his approach to non-dilutive funding. So with that, I will turn it over to Stephanie.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that intro. And I will also say that I've dipped into the eco-friendly side, not just because the masks that we were selling are eco-friendly, but because we used recycled polyester. And so it is an area that we feel is really, really important and continue to support. And so I kind of feel what you guys feel. Obviously, the technology is not nearly the level that your technology is, but definitely feel like there is opportunity with having something that's a little bit more clean or reduces carbon footprint. So we're gonna be able to, go through some details on the grants and how I've leveraged them, how other companies have leveraged them, and what's available out there. So I will say a couple of details with this. When I was first approached by Foresight, they had mentioned to me, we really would like a synopsis, now that it's September, on the COVID resources. And so what I will say is that we have at Granted been working in the last 6 months on all these different COVID programs. I think it's still very important that organizations leverage them. I know that you've heard a lot on the news already, but what I will do for the beginning part of this conversation, just to ensure that everyone has leveraged what they can, is understand what the rule changes have been. There's some additions to a couple of the programs. Some companies may not have leveraged them or they didn't qualify for them and now they do. And so I'm just going to spend the beginning part of this presentation on that because it was meant to be COVID resilience and recovery. And so we want to make sure that we get that resilience part in there. So really briefly, Grants Consulting has been around for almost 10 years now. We are focused primarily on hiring, training, and market expansion grants in Western Canada. And with regards to the COVID resources, we had a lot of companies that we currently work with and new companies also approach us and say, we got to figure out this grant thing strategically. And so that was kind of what we pivoted to do in the last few months, is to kind of support that piece of things for a lot of businesses. And then we've also developed our own technology called Get Granted that matches government grants to business needs. And so I will say that a lot of the high tech type of grants like SDTC and some of these other, digital superclusters, which some people see as a grant, but other people see as just R&D funding, they're not necessarily going to be on our system. What's on our system is going to be more hiring, training, market expansion, and things that general businesses can access, including yours. And so that's something to note. Don't, sign up for it and then go, hey, where's SDTC? Like, we're not niche like that. We also don't have things like forestry grants on there, for example. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about COVID. I know that this is not going to be as interactive as I usually would like, but it would be helpful to kind of take a look at what have you guys leveraged, or what are some of the programs that are out there that you can still leverage. A lot of these programs will allow you to go retroactive. And so I'm just going to briefly go through these for those who don't know of them. And so the first one I'm going to mention, and I separate it by cash savings versus their more kind of loans, is the 10% wage subsidy, or what some industry experts call TEWS. So this 10% wage subsidy is across the board for all businesses, regardless of whether or not they, experience a drop in revenues, but they can access this to offset their staffing costs of 10%. And that 10% is essentially the federal tax and the provincial tax that's deducted off someone's payroll, and that you would usually need to remit to the government. And so it's the lesser of, it's either the 10% or the total amount of tax owed. And so that's for 3 months, and that was essentially kind of mid March until kind of mid-June is the time frame that you could have applied, or sorry, applied this towards salaries paid in that time frame. And so this one was the first program that was launched, and people responded with, it's not enough, this is garbage, like this isn't enough for us. And so then shortly after that, the end of May, they introduced the CEWS program. And so the CEWS program is up to 75% wage subsidy. And recently in the last month, they've gone ahead and extended this program. So it was originally only meant to be 3 months. They then added in an extra month. So it ended up being 4 months. And now they have this, you know, kind of from the end of July or early August through to December, a scaled down process where you might not need 75% wage subsidy. Maybe your wages, your revenues didn't drop a particular number. So say, for example, 30% was the threshold, you had to experience a drop of 30% of revenues. Now with the new extension, you don't have to experience a drop of 30%. You could experience a drop of 5%, 10%, and still qualify for this one. And so there are a lot of rule changes with this CEWS program because it wasn't inclusive very easily of companies that were more startup. And I know that this audience has some companies that are in startup mode. And so if you were not paying yourselves on salary, then you would not be able to access this, or staff members for that matter. But if you were, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at the new rules, especially for the extension, just to see if there is opportunity for you to leverage it. And it's one of these programs that you ideally don't have to commit, like, oh, I'm going to need this until the end of the year. You could say, I qualify for it for these 2 months, and then I don't qualify for it, and then I qualify again. So that's quite important. Tax deferral, so GST, PST, that is helping you with a little bit of cash flow. Work sharing has been extended specifically for COVID companies where you might have a few people join in or be working with you in your marketing department. And then you realize you don't have enough work for them, so they can offset some of their hours with an EI program. CERB, I think all of you guys have heard of this, a $2,000 a month. You could use it for yourself as a business owner or for your staff, or your staff can apply for it as well. And that's been extended to 28 weeks of support. The secret commercial rent support has just recently been extended this week. So it originally only covered up to the end of August, and now it's until the end of September. There's a new PPE gear program as well. And so this one is through Canada United. And this program will offset the cost of you buying masks, face shields, you know, things that maybe you had needed for your staff, maybe barriers, or you did some minor renovations in your office in order to keep your staff safe. And so that it's a reimbursement process up to $5,000. And then we go into these loan programs, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, but maybe some of you guys are not at the level where you'd be able to access these as of yet, because a lot of these programs are going to say, what were your revenues pre-COVID? And then what are you going to be needing the money for, you know, during past COVID? And so I will say, and just mention that the BDC has some leniency with some of these programs. So it would be worth it to check in with them. If you didn't qualify for a BDC loan before, it might now be the time to take a look at that, because they had some shifting of the rules that allowed them to support a larger base of businesses. Okay, the SEVA loan, super easy to get. They've also opened that up to businesses that were previously running out of like a personal bank account. And you know, they've gone into, you don't have to have payroll from last year. You could just have payroll for this year or set expenses. And so definitely look into that. That's essentially a grant, right? Because you get $40,000, but you only have to pay back $30,000, and that's not until the end of 2022. All right, I'm going to breeze through kind of this side really quickly. So this just tells you what are kind of the time frames in terms of support. And because the secret program literally got extended this week, I didn't even update the slide yet. And so it should say 6 months until the end of September. And so that's a really good way for you to negotiate, you know, kind of if you are renting office space, what that would look like. And I'm going to go a little bit more in depth with the CEWS program because there are some differences with this part 1 and part 2, how they calculate revenues. You can now switch. So in the past, if you did qualify for part 1, which was up until, I want to say like early July, then that you can switch it to accrual. So that's something you can speak to your accountant about. They're also going to be reducing the support, as I mentioned. So it's kind of like, hey, let's get you off government support over time. And so you're going to see it decrease from like, I think it decreased up to 85% if you experienced a huge drop in revenues, and it's going to decrease down to like 10% by the end of it all. And so that's important to kind of see and understand what that looks like. And then the calculations are really done on month-to-month basis. So a note of caution on this one, CRA has a different calculator for each month. So don't use the calculator from the last term for this term. Don't make that assumption that it's the same, because the formula is actually quite different, because the rate of support will reduce over time. And so that is something very important. For those who did qualify earlier in the year for the CEWS program, they have the safe harbor rule, where if you qualify for April, May, and June, then they'll still keep your benefit at 75% for the months of July and August. So that is a huge impact. If your sales started to ramp up again in July and August, and you're worried like, hey, I don't have a drop of revenues, whatnot, they'll actually keep that 75% so long as you qualified for April, May, and June. Okay. There are some concerns about how the Qs were offset to CEWS because the 10% was introduced first. So just make sure that you're not double dipping there. If you did not claim the 10%, you should go back and do that, because for the first term, the part 1 of CEWS, they will assume that you've taken 10%. So make sure that you don't lose out on that is what I'm saying. If you have adjustments that are required, they now have the ability for you to go back in and make these adjustments. So I'm going to make a very important point here with regards to adjustments, because it relates to grants as well. Maybe some of you guys have leveraged a hiring grant, and you brought in someone and you were paying them, you know, their normal salaries, but you know that the claim process is maybe not until the end of the placement of this intern, for instance. You can't go and double dip CEWS and the program that you're working on. So let's say, for example, the program the hiring program that you're at is at 75% wage subsidy. You can only claim maximum 25% CEWS. And so this is super important, because this is an area that I think people will get audited on. So you have staff members who have gone through a hiring grant within the period of when you have also qualified for CEWS, and you also went after CEWS. Please remember to not double dip. And if you need to go back and make some adjustments because you're like, well, I don't know if I'm going to get it, or you know, whatever it is, then you should go back in and make that adjustment. So do speak to your accountant about that. Very important that you don't burn the bridge between yourselves and the grantors because you make, you know, a mistake in this area. There are some companies that have these like non-arm's length revenue. So maybe you have a headquarter and you have a subsidiary, and you know, you funnel some revenues from the subsidiary up to the headquarters or vice versa. Just take a look at those requirements. They're very specific to different types of companies and how they would still qualify or not qualify. And 100%, this is a grant. So what that means is that it's fully taxable. Please make sure that you guys keep the money aside to pay the taxes on this, because you don't want to be hit with a big tax bill at the end. There are companies that are leveraging like hundreds of thousands of dollars under the CEWS program, and that gets added to the revenue line. So just keep that in mind. Best practices. So make sure you have your calculations. They will actually potentially audit. So every employee, make sure that you have all the pay stubs, whatever hours they worked. It's not based on average hours, it's based on actual hours worked. Make sure you save the copy of your subsidy calculation, just, you know, as you're using their calculators, which I honestly feel are not bad, okay? Not too hard, time consuming, but not difficult to use. Make sure that you keep copies of them. Don't have a situation where at the end of the year, you know, there's a lot of money being spent. So there's going to be a way that the government will claw back some of the money if things weren't done properly. So please make sure you keep everything for every single term. And so keep a copy of that calculation as well. Be careful of your non-arm's length revenue. So if you are related somehow to this other company, either by shareholders or maybe there's ownership or whatnot, make sure that you keep that information really clear. As well as if you have staff members who are related to you as the business owner, I'm assuming some of you guys are business owners here, then that is considered non-arm's length payroll. There are rules specific to that. So really carefully, do not navigate this yourself, try to get an accountant to work it out with you, and make sure that you fit within what is considered the non-arm's length payroll requirement. And then the overlapping periods for the twos is different from what the twos is. So that was one major confusing point. It's off by 3 days, but it makes a huge difference. So it is very important that you do those calculations correctly as well. Okay. Now we go to just, I wanted to show you the secret rent program. This is if you guys are renting something, you know, a place or whatnot, the rent, the person who is your landlord will absorb 25% of the rent. They will get a grant for 50%, and then you would have to pay 25%. So that's how this program works. I'm just going to breeze through this really quickly. Again, make sure that you do calculate your drop in revenues. The benefit of the extension of the program, though, is they don't need to see that you had a drop in revenues for the last 3 months. So if you had drop in revenues in April, May, and June, but you didn't have it for July, August, and September, then you don't have to worry about that, because that second part, that the second quarter, I would say, of this funding, it's just if you establish that you have a drop in revenues of 70% in quarter 2, that's all they need to see. Okay, so that's something to think about. It's a negotiation process. I've heard horror stories with this with landlords, so it is something that is important and speaks to a little bit of what we're going to be speaking about other grants in terms of keeping good relations. Okay, so in this case, keeping good relations with your landlords, helping them understand where things are at, working together, helping them understand what the eviction legalities are, and then, you know, working to a solution is what I recommend. And then again, it's been extended to 6 months. So keep all the documentation really, really clear for all 6 months. So that is the COVID basics. I'm running out of time. Okay, and so we're going to get to the other types of grants beyond COVID in a minute, but I just wanted to show you, let's say you are a clean tech manufacturer with 45 employees and you have less than $20 million in revenues and you had some layoffs. So these are the programs that I would recommend that you look at. And so you can see in purple, I've now indicated, hey, there are programs that are not just COVID related. This is beyond COVID. And there's now hiring grants or training programs or Can Export and different types of market expansion programs. So this is one that, you know, this is a simple slide to say that you could leverage quite a few. You know, we're looking at 12, potentially even more programs that this manufacturer could leverage. And then with scenario 2, maybe you're an agri-tech processing business, also in clean tech. And these are the COVID support programs. And so it's a little bit different because of the type of business that they are. They would obviously be able to apply for some food-related types of grants. They also would not necessarily qualify for that PPE grant because they're over the size of what that requirement is. And so this is just a snapshot of what that looks like. And then I know some of you might be making, you know, working with construction or making construction materials. This is specifically for a construction firm. And, you know, they didn't have any layoffs, so they're not going to be able to leverage a bunch of other programs related to that. And construction, honestly, is seeing a boom right now, oddly enough. And so there's going to be more limited types of programs that they can leverage. Okay. Now, I'm going to move the conversation out of COVID.
Just before you, sorry, Stephanie, just before you leave the COVID thing, there were a couple questions and maybe you addressed them. And
oh, sorry.
I'm slow, so you might have to repeat things on my behalf.
Okay.
Can you apply for that CEWS program if you're pre-revenue? So you can't, you know, you sort of said that it used to be 30% and you might be able to show a smaller.
Yeah, you do need to have some revenues in order to qualify for it. And they have allowed for revenue comparison of January and February of this year, but you can't if you're completely pre-revenue. That is a sticky point that they weren't able to kind of bend on.
Right, okay, so no pre-revenues. And then so obviously if you started operation during COVID, there's going to be, obviously that program is going to be challenging to apply for, but are there any programs that are specifically kind of targeted to pre-revenue or accessible by pre-revenue companies?
So with regards to the CEBA program, the CEBA program is a loan. It's not a grant necessarily, but it is a $40,000 loan. They don't look at your revenue. as far as I understand it to be, for this new updated version of it. But what they do look at is if you have less than 20,000 in payroll for 2019, then you need to show that you have committed to expenses, whether it be rent, insurance, maybe equipment leases and things like that for the year of 2020. So not even incurred up to date, but just for the year of 2020. And that exceeds more than $40,000. And salaries is one that they're not super, like, I've heard mixed things on, like, if you put, say, for example, salaries, if that would be a concern, I would say just go for it. Just see what you can get. Because I think that salaries are, how are you supposed to run your business if you don't have people's salary? That doesn't work as well. And so if you're pulling dividends, that's going to be an issue. So if you're doing sweat equity, that's going to be an issue. But definitely I would take a look at that loan program. Other types of things, it would be then, some of the, I think somebody had mentioned here, like working with IRAP, there are certain programs that, and Steve will probably speak on this as well in a few minutes, but programs where it's helping companies, existing companies, kind of address COVID-related needs, and they'll give you funding for the R&D components of it. And so that is grantable. It's not a repayable component, but that would be another program that startups could qualify for.
Okay, awesome. And then I think it's maybe just a general comment, and I'll use my license to interpret this from Veritas Research. Boo earns. How can we tell the government that they need to help specifically pre-revenue companies? Because from my perspective, if you look at that chasm from the early adopters to the early majorities, that's going to get wider as people become more risk averse in the current situation. So what funding options are there for those, as companies become more risk averse around pilots? How are you going to get those first dollars into the company? So I do sympathize with that unsmiley face that Maka has posted there, and how can we communicate that back?
Well, let me tell you that this next section of stuff is probably going to, hopefully shine a better light on the government with regards to other programs that they're offering that are not just for companies that have been well established. Of course, on the COVID side of things, one of the considerations is, has this company been able to sustain? And if you're pre-revenue, then it's hard to determine that at that level. And I think that there was a IRAP program, but that money just went like that. And that was back in June, I want to say, where companies that were pre-revenue could apply for existing staff members to be able to kind of get an offset on salaries. But because of the limited amount of funding that was in there, it just went so quickly. And it was like overwhelming response. So to answer your question, Steve, there's a couple of things that you guys can do. Number one, you can write to the government and specifically to your MP and explain kind of like where are things at and why the fact that there is not support for pre-revenue companies that are in this innovative kind of state that you guys are in, which is quite different than someone starting up a restaurant, right? Like you guys are in a different category. And so explaining that a little bit, I mean, another thing is like Foresight could be an advocate for this as well, because you guys, Jeanette, has such good relations with government and whatnot. Sometimes it's like what you guys say in conjunction with maybe some of these other, like a BC Innovates or whatever, and kind of like coming together and just going, we need this. And whether that goes to the provincial level or it goes to the federal level, it will eventually move its way up there. I think though that I've been on conference calls all like through the entire term of COVID, 8 a.m. There's always a conference call, and recently they've reduced it to 2 times a week. But it's constantly talking about how startups are not able to access. So the fact that the CEBA program, the loan, has been changed up. They also have another program called the Regional Relief Fund, which is RRRF. And you can apply through that through WD. And there's also, if you're a female entrepreneur, you can apply through that through the Women Enterprise Center. I know that's not what you guys want to hear. I know you guys are looking for grants. We'll get into that here. But at least it gets some money into your pocket so that you can pay for things to keep things running. And then let's see where these other grants can take you. Okay. So totally empathize. I feel for you guys as well. But I think that there's definitely some other opportunities here. So let's talk about what these other opportunities are. The key thing that you need to know is that there are always different rules for different grants, okay? And through the life of COVID, I will also say they will tweak different rules based on what's happening in the economy and what's happening in industry. And so the basics with grants is that, I'm going to say something that's even more basic than that. If your business is not registered properly, so meaning if you are a sole proprietor and you didn't go to BC and register it, that already eliminates you from probably 50% of the grants that I know of, if not 70% of the grants. So making sure that your business is registered properly, and it's so odd, I would think that people would go and do it, but often they'll go as far as a name request and then they'll forget that they actually have to go and do their actual registration. So that is important. If you are incorporated already, that's great because that helps with your shred and all this other stuff, but you also need to take a look at when you incorporate. So let's say, for example, you bring in a new partner and you say, hey, I want to bring in somebody new, so I'm going to reincorporate and make it a clean cut. I actually wouldn't do that. I would keep your original corporation and find a way legal with your lawyer to figure out how you can integrate this new person in by buying shares or whatever it is, because then you have the length of business is longer. You're not starting from like, oh, I'm a 2-month business now. When you go apply for grants, there are certain grants that will say, we won't let you apply until you've hit 1 year. And so if you're, readjusting your corporate structure and whatnot, that could become an issue for you. There also are issues with some grants where they say, we need to see that you have a certain number of employees. And it's reasonable. We're taxpayers as well. So it would be hard pressed for a government to say, oh, you're 0 employees, let's give you $50,000. So the idea and the requirement for the government is to say, we want increased employment. So if we give you funding, we're hoping that you're going to be increasing more employees. And it's a bigger threshold chasm to cross when you go from 0 to their first employee. And so ideally, you have a few people in your business and you're paying them, even if it's a part-time salary, they're still on salary. Your industry also matters. You guys are in one of the most wealthy industries in terms of like support, particularly under this government that we're in, that I've been seeing. It's also the trend in worldwide right now, with clean tech is the thing to get into and ensure that we are able to reduce carbon footprint in any way we can. And so that should open up a lot more opportunities for you than, say, for example, like a restaurant down the street. Financially, very important that you have to have financial resources in order to be able to afford some of the grants. A lot of the grants will say, we can't give you just money up front. We have to give you money based on certain milestones that you've hit. And so if you're hiring someone, maybe it's at the middle of their placement. If it's an 8-month placement at 4 months, they're going to say, make sure that you give us the pay stubs and everything that you've paid this person up to the end of the 4 months. If it's a training grant, same thing. You would have paid for the training before you can make the claim back. If it's a market expansion grant, that you've paid for your marketing, that you've paid your sales rep, whatever it is, and then there's an opportunity for you to claim it back. So even though the grant is given, or funding contribution is given at the beginning, you sign off on documents at the beginning of your project, it's guaranteed as much as you follow through with these activities and that you have proof that you paid for this stuff, okay? They've done it the other way around before. I can tell you one of the first programs to work on, they were like 5,000, 5,000, you get 5,000, you get 5,000. And then what ended up happening is people would take the 5,000 and go buy a car. And it was meant for training for their staff. And they would go apply for it. And then they're like, show me a receipt of $5,000 of training. And they're like, oh, I went and spent it on a car. It's like, well, that's not what it's for. And then it makes it really difficult for the government to claw it back. So those are things, that's part of the reason why. Having financial security, can't tell you how many companies have come to me like every year and says, Steph, if I don't get a grant, my company's going under. And I turn to them and I go, your company's going under. Because that's not what grants are there for, right? So make sure that you are financially secure. You have a good little bit of a runway so that you can keep the grant going and execute on the activity. A couple other bullet points that are important: track record. So making sure that you follow through. If you apply for something, that if something goes off the rocker on it, that you kind of explain yourself or explain what happened here. COVID is a great excuse to do things, why things went off the rocker. So making sure that you keep a good track record and a good relationship. I was speaking to Steve about this a couple of days ago, was making sure that you keep a good relationship with your grantor as well and keep them informed on kind of what's going on. And then this bullet point is for you guys. Any innovation that puts Canada on the map is something that I find Canada is really intrigued to invest in. And so, you know, let's not be like, oh, I have a technology that, well, recycled materials, for instance. So it's something that has been around, and people already have developed it, and it's kind of in its, you know, growth, if not mature stage. It's nothing new, nothing fancy. So that's not going to put Canada on the map. But if you guys are developing some solar panels that can be used, you know, in a particular way that's very unique from other solar panels, or maybe some energy, you're able to derive energy from soil, or you know, something that is really quite unique, there is always potential funding for developing of that, and also marketing of it as well. Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit of storytelling for the next 25 minutes. So if you like stories, then keep listening. And if you don't, then that I would say wait at 11. Steve will be joining us and you can learn more from him. So I have gone, like at Granted, we probably processed about, I'm going to say 1,100 grant applications over the course of our, we've processed probably about 8,000 grant applications over the course of the life of Granted. And on an average, it's like about 1,100 applications every year that we do. So we've made these mistakes, and I'm going to share them with you because they're really important that you don't make them, or that you know of them. So the first one, hands down, is not looking at a grant properly. When you look at a grant, do not just see, oh, there's funding there that will cover, you know, a new hire, and that new hire might have to be super high tech, they might need to be an engineer, whatever, and you write up a job description that's super high tech, and then you go and apply for it, you get the funding, but then you decide, oh, I'm going to change this person's role 2 months down the road and turn them into an administrative assistant or a project manager. And so you're not looking at the rules and regulations around that grant. Or worse yet, you want to apply for an executive assistant, and then you put an application together, and it's only for tech positions. It goes both ways, right? It's you apply for it, you get rejected. And part of the reason is it's really clear this is for tech positions only. So unless your administrative assistant is doing tech work, you're not going to be able to qualify for it. So assessing the grant properly is hands down the first issue that a lot of companies come across, that they just don't do it. They don't read it well, they don't read it properly, or they don't take the time to understand the terminology. And so that usually results in, I'm guessing this, but I will say that it's probably pretty accurate, 60% of rejection. The second one, applications incomplete. This is not like writing a multiple choice exam when you fill out a grant application where you go, oh, you know, I don't know the answers to these 3 things, so I'm just going to leave it blank. And I can get at least 93% because I know the answers to the other rest. No, it's not like that. So when you put a grant application together, very important that you ensure that you fill everything in and that you actually answer what they're asking. So this often happens with organizations that are super excited about their technology or their service or their product, and they go, tell me about your business. And you just write this whole long thing about, you know, how this product can serve the market, and how, you know, there's all these statistics about the need in the market. They're not asking that. They're like, tell me about your business. So tell them about who runs the business, what industry are you in, how many people do you have, how long has the business been around, like basics. Don't go into all the details about your market and how you have investors and all this other stuff, because there are probably other parts in the application that you might need to tell them that. Or they read it and they go, you're not reading this, so I'm not going to read the rest of your application. Okay, so next we have making assumptions. So making assumptions is a very common error in that companies will say, oh, I've applied for this grant before. No, you know, and then they're going to be like, oh yeah, well, of course, we've got this situation where companies are applying and they're like, oh, I've done this before, I fill it in, I take the last year's application and I just fill in the fields the same way. And they assume that the rules haven't changed. There is a grant that we work on, it's a training grant in BC. It's changed 153 times in 5 years, 153 times. We track every single change, and they're not like launching one change at a time. They usually launch 20 changes at a time or 25 changes at a time. But just because you qualified for something last year does not mean that you're going to qualify for it this year. So that's very, very important. Another thing to look at is, not researching frequently. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of places that you can find grant information, and I'll probably send it to you. Probably the easiest way is in the form of an email afterwards to Steve, and you can distribute it afterwards, Steve. But you know, there's a Innovation Canada has a portal. Get Granted also has a list of free grants that you can get, no cost. Okay, both of these portals are absolutely free. Just depends on how much information you feel you need in order to successfully apply for the grant. I do like the Innovation Canada portal. I think that, and they've also recently added in something like, tell me about your business for COVID support as well. But one thing that I will say that is a challenge with the Innovation Canada site is that it is managed federally, but there are a lot of grants that are municipal or provincial. And so by the time these grants get updated into the portal, it could be a couple of months down the road. So I would be very cautious as to the accuracy of some of the grants. Like some of them are long-standing, they're around for a while, but some of them are, you know, and I'll speak on a couple of them in a minute, but like they're super aggressive and there's a lot of interest in them. So the funding goes really quickly. If you're relying on a government system to provide you with the data, you can expect to wait a little bit. Okay, so make sure that you are constantly looking, or you have somebody on your team tasked to do ongoing research. Sign up for the Twitter feeds that have, you know, through ISED or some of these, you know, clean tech like NRCan or IRAP or NRC, you know, any of these organizations that issue funding to companies like yours, that issue funding to technology businesses. Make sure that you sign up for their Twitter feeds, their LinkedIn feed, also so that you get notified of these, but also join their mailing list. And so that's another way that you can kind of develop a little bit more system in your research. Okay, missed grant intention. So this is a little bit of the number one, not assessing it properly, but missing the grant intention is kind of a big deal. So let's say, for example, you are going after a market expansion grant, and the market expansion grant says you need to take your products or services outside of Canada in order to qualify for this, okay? So you go, that's great. And then you see a virtual event that's in Toronto, and you go, hey, I'm gonna be attending this virtual event, and we're gonna have a virtual trade show, right? Because of COVID, you can't fly out there, or you can fly out there, but you don't want to. And so you sign up for this, and you apply for the grant, and then you get rejected. And you wonder why. And part of the reason why is, yes, there are customers, let's say your market is the United States, there are customers who probably will be buying in that, or looking for vendors in that Toronto event, okay? Or even Globe here locally in Vancouver. Like, let's say you're here at Globe and you're like, oh, it's local, we're gonna do this one, perfect. But the challenge is the rules and regulations are really clear. The events have to take place in the market that you're gonna be expanding into. And this grant is a foreign export market grant. Toronto or Vancouver, last time I checked, is not outside of Canada. And so they're going to have to reject you just based on the fact that they can't approve you. It doesn't matter that you have 90% of the constituents or the delegates joining from overseas. It matters that the event is not in the place of where you would be, you know, expanding or doing business. Okay, so very important that you understand what the grant intention is. You read the rules and regulations of what the eligible expenses are, so that you don't put all this time into writing up the grant and then get rejected on a minor technicality. Now, some of these grants will allow you, some of the grants will be assessed in a way where you apply for 100,000. There's 30,000 that they see as ineligible, and they'll just piece that out. But some of them are just straight up yes or no. And so if you have the wrong information in there, it ends up being a no, then that's it. You don't have a second chance for it. So just be really careful that you read through the grant intention and that you meet the requirements of it. One hit wonder. So I love this category where people feel, oh, I got a grant, it's one, and I'm done. And the reality is, if you really want to access grants successfully, you're constantly on top of your research. You're speaking to, maybe your IRAP, IPA, you're building relationships with these organizations, and you're not seeing grants as a one-time, one-hit wonder. There are so many grants. I mean, there's an organization that we worked with that got $250,000 just in hiring, training, and market expansion grants. Not even in the tech, IRAP, that like IRAP shred, they got that as well. That was closer to another 250, but they got $500,000. And the key thing was that they kept up with it. They knew that there would be this program, they overlapped it with this other program. And so they saw it as almost like something that they needed to fund some of the financing of what activities they were doing. And they took the time to make sure that they understood what programs they could leverage. So one-hit wonders, not the best. And the other challenge with one-hit wonders is you get experience, you start building up your acumen with grants, and then you do it once, and then you essentially, like a year later or 6 months later, you've forgotten it. So keeping it going is like exercising, right? Like you want to just kind of keep that muscle going. Applying too late. So this is constantly an issue where people see a deadline and it's like, oh, it's at the end of September, I'll just apply on the 29th. And so there are two challenges with this. One, the grant applications are assessed in two different ways. One, they would do it where we get 50 applications, and then we will go through a sorting method and process, and we sort that out. And then we take a look at who applied first and then who applied the 50th. And then they go in order of, let's say, for example, 30 out of the 50 applications are solid. They'll go, who applied first? And we can fund 10 of them. So the first 10 will get funded. Guess what happens to your 30th application? It doesn't get funded. And so that's too late. The other basic of applying too late is just you miss the deadline. Or that you have some letters of support that you need, and you need a partner in order to apply for this. And then you go in and you go, hey, can I get a letter of support? And you tell them on the 28th of September and the deadline is the 30th, you're not going to get that letter of support. Or if you do, it's not going to look super great. So very important that you kind of plan things out. I would say take a look at grants and start planning for them a good month in advance. Okay. I see an acronym here from Ricardo, but I don't know what it means, so I will skip it, but you can spell it out for me. Who are your partners is another one. So this was one that is very important because you guys do so much R&D. Often you will have a partner like a university that will be helping you with it. Or you might have another industry partner or a research center that's going in on the grant together with you. So establishing who they are, making sure that you have good rapport with them. Don't just put them in an application because they can do what they say they can do. Make sure they can do it. And so that's also very important as well. Like identify your partners, build a relationship. Who are they? What can they do? What value do they add to the project? And then go in with a grant application with their name on it. I've seen this happen once in a while where one co-founder will apply for a grant and not tell the other co-founder. And then the other co-founder is like, we're doing what? And so this is a challenge, right? You always have to let your stakeholders know, whether your stakeholders are your partners, your investors, your staff, maybe sometimes even your customers, if you needed to pivot something and maybe their product or service gets impacted as a result of it, you have to kind of let people know what is happening. And ideally you do it before you apply. Okay, so that's another very important point. We're going to talk a little bit about leaving money on the table. So this one I'm going to lean a little bit more on because there's some strategy around how you can do this. So let's say, for example, Ricardo's company applies for $100,000 and it is to do research on a particular technology that they are developing. Okay, so what they're paying for is maybe a scientist, and maybe they're paying for a little bit of administrative cost, and maybe they're paying for some materials or supplies. Let's say that's what the grant is for. And then Ricardo goes and he identifies that, like, hey, we're kind of halfway through the spend here, and we realize that we don't have the right material or we don't have the right scientist. Okay, so something gets thrown. So the idea is, do you then continue on with this project? Because you had already written out saying we're going to achieve this outcome and we're going to be able to do this and we're going to be able to do that. And you keep going on doing that if you don't want to do it, or you know that it's not going to work in the right way. So the answer is ideally you don't do that. And what you do is you go to the grantor and you explain to them, hey, listen, we did this research. It took us kind of in this direction. We see an opportunity to spend the money in this way, which achieves a different outcome. Tell me what I need to do in order to facilitate keeping this grant, but maybe adjusting the outcomes to this tangent that we found is probably most successful. And then they will tell you whether or not, and hopefully the tangent is still within like clean tech or whatever kind of genre you applied under. They will tell you what they can do about it. They might not be able to give you the full grant, but maybe they give you 80,000 instead of 100,000. So Ricardo then walks away with 80 grand instead of 100, but that's much better than spending 100, where 50 of the 100, you're like, actually, I knew it wasn't going to work. And I just did it because the grant said that I need to follow through. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. It's always nice to ensure that you have the conversations before you do the pivot, because I've seen that as a problem as well. People are like, oh, sorry, I didn't do it right, or we didn't tell you. And then this is like at the end of the year when the final project outcomes are due. And then they go, we didn't tell you this, but we ended up spending it on this instead. And we got this amazing outcome as a result. It's like, no, you do it before. You get permission before. So I always relate, grant writing a little bit to parenthood. If any of you guys are parents, or sure all of you guys have gone through this as well. You go and borrow money, or you ask for $100 from your parents to say, hey, I'm going to go and, buy this book. And then you take the 100 and you go and spend it on a video game. And then you bring back the video game and your parent goes, what the hell, what is this? And it's like, well, I decided to spend it on this instead. You think that your parent is going to give you $100 the next time you ask for it? Well, I mean, maybe your parents are amazing and they would, but my parents absolutely be like, hell no, we're not going to give you any more money. This is kind of like what happens if you don't ask for permission first, sometimes with the grantors. Or they go, you know what, we'll give it to you because we're at year end, we need to spend the budget anyway. But you come and ask me for more money next time, and the answer is absolutely going to be no. So you just don't burn that bridge, okay? In terms of strategic leverage, so grants are done, and this kind of relates back to the one-hit wonder thing, but where you need to think about what your business is actually doing for the year. And Steve will speak to this in a few minutes as well. But let's say you plan out, this is what my business is going to be doing for, from now until summer of 2021. And so at that point, you then start doing the research on the grants. You don't do it the other way around. You don't go and look for grants and go, interesting. They will let you spend money if you develop a technology in clean tech that has to do with agri-tech. And we don't do that. We do solar panels, but we don't do anything to do with agri-tech. But there's a grant for it. Let me go after that. That's not how you do it. And the reason is because it's going to take you off your path of what you originally wanted to do. So here's my suggestion. Develop a one-page business plan or a one-page business canvas. Write down what are the key things that you want to achieve this year. Identify what are the roles of the people that you need to hire for. Identify the different the different trainings or things that maybe you have some knowledge gaps in your team that you need to make sure gets filled up. And then identify, what areas of expansion or collaboration or further research and whatnot you want to do. Then you go after the research. Okay, so once you've identified your plan, then you go after research. Then here's the difficult part. You don't look at grants that don't match your strategy. So you can find them and you can kind of, bookmark them, but you're going to focus on the ones that actually will move your project or your objectives forward. And I know it sounds simple, but I got to tell you, there's a lot of people who do it the other way. They go and see grants and they're like, oh, it's a free grant to hire someone. Oh, we could use an extra person. They don't think about the fact that there are two people who have to run the research and run the business. And then now you've got this like third green recent grad who might not be able to contribute much, but needs a lot of mentorship and honing. And then it takes you off your rocker and you go, oh, but they're free. Like, no, who cares if they're free? You need to make sure that you are looking at what your needs are. But here's the other key thing, be flexible with your start and time frame of it. So let's say, for example, there's a grant to go and do some market collaboration. and that grant is to go to Germany to do this collaboration, okay? It comes up in November of this year. And in your plan, you were like, hey, we want to do a collaboration in January with Germany. Obviously, what you're going to do is like assume that they're not going to have another program like this in January. You're probably going to apply earlier and just kind of stretch that time frame back a little bit so that it gets covered. And so that's the other important thing is, yes, you don't want to be applying for things for sure that don't meet your requirements, but you also want to keep an eye out for like, oh, I wanted to hire someone for March, but there's no hiring grants in March. So April is when the government fiscal budget renews. I'm going to be hiring them in April. And so the idea is that they can then, you know, like whoever the company is, they can then go, oh, well, I can hire in April. I'm okay to not have to hire someone in March if it means that 75% of the wages are covered, okay? We got 5 more minutes here before Steve joins us. And if he's here early, then, and I don't know if he is, but then I'll have him start a little early as well. But this slide, this bullet point might do it. So no follow through. No follow through is one of the worst things that you can do. It is a little bit of a showstopper with grants, okay? So whether this be you are hiring someone or you are applied for training grants or you are looking at market expansion, you do R&D, it doesn't matter what bucket of funding. No follow through to me means that you don't have the commitment or really desire to ensure that things move forward in the way that you want it to move forward. And so the challenge there is the grantors are essentially, they're carving out a bunch of budget that they have also quotas for, right? So if an organization in clean tech says, we have $3 million to give away, and let's say they give $1 million to you, and you go, oh, I think I'm going to be doing this, and you write an amazing proposal and you send it in, and then you realize like, oh, this didn't work, or half of my staff quit, or COVID hit, and all these things happened. And so I'm just going to dodge the government. Like I've spent their money and I'm just going to dodge them. That's not going to work because your name's on it. That's one thing. Your company's reputation is on there. They need to see outcomes. And whether these outcomes be failed outcomes, they still have to see that. And so ensuring that you move forward with a grant, making sure that if there is something that is a problem that, you know, we go back to bullet point number 10, which is have a conversation with the grantor and explain to them what is actually happening. And I'd much rather you take a little lesser amount than to not follow through and just dodge, because the next time, and this is where the grantors are starting to connect with each other a little bit as well. You know, Innovate BC is connected to MyTex now. So if there are names of companies that pop up through Innovate BC, where it's like, oh, these guys have never followed through, they always hire people and then they get rid of them as soon as the grant's done, or whatever it is, we probably would work with them again. I'm sure that MyTex would be like, oh, I don't know if I really want that, right? And so that's an area that I think is also very important, is understanding that things are linking up a lot with technology these days, and making sure that you're able to work with organizations if there is something that changes, and that if you can't follow through something, that you are really clear in your communication about what you'd like to do about that. But dodging is not the way to do it. So with that, I'm going to answer the question. In your experience, does that put the grant more at risk? So I didn't see this question until just now, so I'm going to say the not follow through or the no strategic leverage. Where did this question come up, Ricardo?
I'm having issues with mic, sorry. So the question is, can you hear me?
Yes.
The question is whether or not, let's say we do all the tests, we apply for a certain grant or around a certain area, and then we're like, oh, actually this is completely different. And we contact the granting agency. Does that then, what's the probability, I guess, of them saying, oh, then you don't get the grant, or you don't get the money, or we're going with somebody else? Like, what's the probability of that happening, I guess?
Low. So a really good question. Thanks for that question. So it's low, but it does depend on how you put it forth to the grantors, right? So if you're like, hey, at the very early stages, we knew it was off, and then we just kept going with it to see if it would correct itself, and you're able to explain where things are at, then that's fine. right? But if you knew from the beginning that what you put in the application is not actually what you guys are doing, then we've got a problem. Mm-hmm. So R&D is not an exact science. And for those who access Shred, which if you haven't done it, please think about it and make sure that you guys put yourselves on payroll and if you are in research and whatnot, because it is a bunch of money that a lot of countries don't have anywhere near access to. And so we're very fortunate in Canada that we're very supportive of R&D, but R&D is meant to be research and development. So you're researching, you're developing, it sometimes doesn't go that way. It's more in how you explain it. And it's more in ensuring that they're informed than it is like, oh, well, then you're not going to get this funding. If at all possible, it's helpful for you to realign what those outcomes would be if you were to do research, and also to take a look to make sure that whatever the new research that you're doing, it's still relevant potentially to that particular industry. So if you were like, oh, it doesn't work for ag tech, and let's say this is through Agri-Food Canada, and then they go, okay, well, I understand that this doesn't work for ag tech, and you found that it actually works for another genre or industry, then they might not be able to continue to support your funding. That is possible. Mm-hmm. But if it still kind of benefits ag tech, then that might be okay. Okay. So with that, it's 11:01. So I would, I'm going to introduce Steve now, but let me just make sure that he's there. Steve, hi.
Hi, I'm here.
So I'm going to briefly introduce Steve because he is just a wealth of knowledge and really aligned with the type of funding that you guys are looking for. So Steve, as our other Steve has mentioned, he's a Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Terramera. So Terramera does ag tech and developments to there. Oh, sorry, I'm going to skip this slide. You guys will see a slide later, but let's get to this. And, you know, there's a lot of accolades that he has. He's also taught in the faculty at the Arizona State University and has essentially been involved in bio and clean tech for most of his life, half in education and in academic, and then the other half in industry. So I think that his track record speaks volumes. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through a few questions. And I'm actually just going to put this slide up. Steve, the first question I have for you is, tell me a little bit more, or tell us a little bit more about the amount of funding that you've been successful just with Terramera alone. And I'll let you kind of walk through this slide.
Sure. Yeah, so the slide that's up there now summarizes our current funding. This is not all the funding we've ever had. It's just the awards that are in play right now. And it's not that all of this money comes in this year. Some of these are 2-year awards. A couple of them are actually 3-year awards. But over the past, I would say 2 years, we have applied to a number of different programs and brought in close to $10 million of money overall that's been used to support primarily our R&D efforts. And we do this by a couple of key strategies. One is, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, this is really important. Apply for projects that really support the work that you want to do. You would be surprised how hard it is to spend grant money if it's not on the work that you're actually supposed to be working on. So you need to make sure that you're applying to do the work that you want to do. It needs to be innovative in order to get funded. And once it comes in, you need to very carefully track spending, make sure you're spending it, track results so that you can report properly, et cetera, and use, really actively manage those grants as they come in. If you look over the list here, what you'll see is that there are a variety of different sources. So digital supercluster, we actually have 2 supercluster grants. As far as I know, we're the only company that does. One is a computational biochemistry platform for crop health. That's a computational chemistry project that merges robotics, machine learning, genomics into one project. And we have leveraged that initial one with additional funding from Innovate BC that supports that same type of work in an adjacent space, but allows us to extend the work that we get done. and also through MyTax, because part of this supercluster grant involves collaborators at Simon Fraser University, and we have been able to use the MyTax to help support the students who are on that. SDTC, we've got one active. We had another one before this. This is for developing natural products that can be used for controlling agricultural pests. Because we had that SDTC grant, it turned out that SDTC had some additional funds available, the government made available to support SDTC grant holders around COVID. And so we got the stimulus funds basically because we had an SDTC grant. So you never know when those sorts of things might come up. Innovate BC, so this is a provincial funding agency, and we've been able to use that again to leverage our supercluster grant, and we have another one on insect management. That's a collaboration with folks at UBC. So we do a lot with different universities. That's one of the key themes for many of these grants, is many of them are intended to promote collaborations between universities and companies. Many of them, like Innovate, the money goes to the university, but you can use the collaboration at the university to get work done that you need. You can see we have an IRAP grant that's running right now. It's a relatively smaller one, but it's allowing us to do some fundamental work on insecticide applications using microbial startups, or microbial fractions in this. And then here we have 2 awards from Microsoft right now. So this is another place. It's not just government, provincial or federal. There are places you can look to get funding outside from other companies. And Microsoft, I think this Microsoft Azure for Startups is a great example. You can apply to that, and if they like your project and they think it will work well on their Azure platform, they will give you substantial amounts of money that allow you to do high performance computing, and that's what these 2 are for. One of them is involved in support for a COVID-19 grant. This is a case where because we had certain expertise in machine learning and in genomics and molecular biology, we saw an opportunity. We came up with an idea. It's not in our core work, but we felt it was important, that the idea was important enough. And given that that COVID-19 is such a huge deal, we decided to go ahead and apply for a grant from Digital Supercluster, and we were funded, and Microsoft is a partner on that, and they're providing a high-performance computing platform for that. So this is the one case where we're doing a project that is not specifically in our main wheelhouse, but we as a company decided we were going to prioritize this, and it's a collaboration with UBC and several other companies. This innovation assistance program, this is another specific COVID response from the government. Again, there because we were funded. And then this is a small one. I put this in here. Actually, it says 0, but it's about $10,000. This 4D Labs at SFU is a really nice resource if you want to do, in our case, electron microscopy. And then we have SHRED, which helps to support things. So this is, you can see here that the current amount that we have on the books of committed funding is just on this is about $7 million, and we're in the process of applying for more. So there you can get substantial funding if you are running truly innovative, groundbreaking research platforms. You can get substantial funding, and we aim every year to support at least a third of our R&D spend by non-dilutive funds. And in this case, we've accomplished that. We're there this year and next, as far as we can tell.
Great. So, what's also interesting is we look at the project size of almost 20 million and the secured funding. So you guys are absolutely hitting the goal of at least 30% of 7 million. So, do you keep an eye on this, guys? Like, you got to make sure that you understand that not all of the funding is going to be non-dilutive and non-repayable, although Steve has been an expert in being able to access it. I do feel also that his background in academic also helps with his ability to write some of this stuff up and have that connection to the partners that he's speaking to. So UBC, SFU, my tax specifically. And so I think it's also important that you see there's a lot of investment that's required either through investors or retained earnings or whatnot for projects to move forward. And a portion of it is funded by either government or through other industry associations. Okay, so second question. Steve, tell me, what were some of the expectations that you had of grant funding?
Great question. So I joined Terramera about 3.5 years ago. I was coming from University of Wisconsin. I'd been a professor for the past 10 or 11 years. Before that, I was in industry for about 10 years. So, from that academic mindset, my goal is to support our research. And frankly, that's also my goal at Terramera, is to support our research. What I expect is that that we would get funding that will allow us to push further than we would otherwise be able to do, take more risk, let's say, than we would otherwise be able to do in terms of trying innovative approaches if we're purely operating on our investors' funds. So we want to be able to use this to push harder, faster on the work, and also to show our investors that we are leveraging their money, that every time they put $1 into the company, we are matching it with another 30 to 50 cents. It's good investor relations, and it also allows us to get a lot more done. In terms of what I expect from the granting agencies, I just want to know that they are doing a good job of reviewing the grants, and that the reviewers are technical experts who are capable of understanding the proposals, providing good feedback, good critiques. Even when you don't get a grant, if you get good critiques back, it helps you the next time. And so from the funding agencies, that's what I'm looking for, good feedback. And then when we do get a grant, for them to be good partners in helping us to manage the grant.
Great. I will go on to the next question, which is, what has grants allowed Terramera specifically to do?
Well, as I just mentioned, it allows us to push further, faster. One of the key things, I'll just use the grant that's at the top, the computational biochemistry platform. One of the key things that's permitted us to do is, rather than collecting data we're an ag tech company, so we're often collecting data on crop disease or insects attacking crops. So rather than collecting data in the traditional way where you start an experiment, maybe you inoculate plants with a fungus, you treat it within a particular way, and you have your technicians going in and following the progression of the disease under the different treatments, et cetera. What that supercluster grant allowed us to do was to apply robotics and machine vision to in an automated way collect data on disease progression on plants, and then turn that into a machine readable form so that we basically don't have to be sending our scientists into the growth chambers to monitor progress of the plant disease. We basically have our computers and our cameras measuring that and then telling us how the experiment is progressing. And that gets fed into a larger database where we apply machine learning algorithms that help us decide early on whether an experiment is on a good path or not. And if we can predict early that an experiment is failing, let's say for non-technical reasons, like there's the disease just didn't take hold for whatever reason, et cetera, we can cease experiments early and turn those growth chambers over faster and get more experiments in a year. And so that kind of funding allows us to do things differently. And that in the long run makes us more efficient, better, faster. And it's the kind of thing that if we were purely running on sort of a base budget, we wouldn't be able to invest in that kind of work.
Yeah, And I thought that, you know, what you responded to in terms of how the impact of the investors, like I think that also grants do help with that, right? If you're able to stretch the dollar of these investors and tell them, like, we're not just leveraging your money, your investments, we're also leveraging government money to ensure that things, you know, we're being cautious of cost and whatnot, that also I think would add to your ability to fundraise better. So it's not a proven fact, but I think it always helps to say something like that. There's that effort there.
Yeah, I mean, we hear that from our investors. They say that they like the fact that they know that their money's being leveraged.
Yeah, amazing. And then a couple more questions. So why would you say grants are important to businesses? Like, why should, because it is a little bit annoying. You got to fill out all these forms and you got to know what they're talking about. And just hearing you speak, Steve, makes me, you know, really anchored into the decision that we didn't go into writing technical grants that granted, because just the amount of knowledge that you would need to accrue over time to be able to explain your technology in a good way is like it's almost like an art in itself. And so tell me a little bit about why grants for businesses, why is it important?
So, I mean, I've already mentioned a number of things, but I'll try to add on to that. So one of the things that I find is a real advantage for us is that when you want to put together a complicated project and you're trying to make sure that it fits the direction of your company and also the requirements of the grants, as you talked about, you know, earlier, what is the intent of the granting agency when they put out a call for proposals? What it forces you to do is to think hard about what are your internal capabilities, what are really the goals that you have, and then if you don't have the internal capabilities that you need to get there, who do you need to talk to? And it drives you out into the community, into other companies, large and small. They're not listed on here, but there are probably a dozen companies with whom we have relationships because we have gone out and needed their specific expertise in order to get a piece of a project done. And actually, if you look at that total project size, that's not just purely our spend. Part of that is spent by other companies on projects where we're collaborative. Same thing with the universities. It forces us to reach out and find the faculty that are doing the work that is complementary to what we need to get done. And building those relationships with other companies and university faculty. And not only does that help with a particular project that you're working on, but it also starts to drive new ideas because you're having conversations, and that builds new directions for the company. So I consider grants to be catalysts in a couple of key ways. One of them is financially. It helps us get more done with the resources that we have. And one of them is intellectually. It allows us to think broader, think bigger, identify resources and people who can help us. It sort of, if you're sort of a wallflower, it forces you to get out there and really start talking within the ecosystem in ways that that will help drive your company forward.
Yeah, I love that. And one other one that I will bring up that to me, it was a learning as well, is the validation. When you go in with an application and you're competing against 50 or 100 other organizations and they pick yours, it also adds to this, like, hey, we've been supported by the government and they see the value. And not that, you know, if you're not chosen, they don't see it, but it just adds a little, you know, kind of like star next to your company.
It does. It adds a bit of prestige. I mean, I'm not like really blowing my own horn here, but I'll give you an example. That COVID grant, the Digital Supercluster COVID grant, they had 600 letters of intent. They funded 18 proposals, and we got one of them. And we're not a virus company, but our idea was creative enough and important enough and unique enough that we were able to get that money. So sometimes the competition is huge, but when you break through, it tells you and it tells your team that you're doing something right. You are thinking in novel ways, and you've got a team that it really can push forward. So it also, a win on something like that it's a big motivational thing internally as well.
Yeah, I love it. And one final question, and I'll summarize this with one core tip that you had mentioned, and I also mentioned in the presentation is, you know, I want to have you share maybe 2 other tips or lessons that you learned about grants. But one that I think everyone heard quite a bit already was that you should stay on your path and not let the grant kind of dictate where you should be or where your organization should be going. Give me a couple other ones, other tips or lessons that you learned.
Okay, so a critical one is have a good relationship, build a good relationship with the program managers in the programs that you're going to apply to. It's important for them to know who you are, to know who your company is, the work that you do, why it's important, where you've had successes in the past. And their job is to help you. They are there as the liaison with these granting agencies to identify the best work and to fund it. So they genuinely want you to be successful. They want to see exciting work coming in. They want to see a path forward for it. And they're there to help. So build those relationships, get to know people. It's really important, and they will be a wonderful resource for you. The second one, and I alluded to this earlier, is when you do get funding, make sure you have the internal resources devoted to managing that grant. As I said before, it's harder than you would expect to spend the money once you get it. Even if you're doing exactly what you said on the grant, if you're not tracking people's time, and if you're not tracking progress versus milestones, then when it comes up time to report, and many of these have reporting as often as monthly, you're not going to be in a position to show your success. So, and if you can't demonstrate your success, even if you were successful, if you didn't show it, it doesn't matter. So make sure that you devote the internal resources. Often you can include that time of people in the grant for the people who will be tracking and reporting. Make sure you devote that, because if you don't do a good job reporting, and they see, the granting agency sees you as, again, whether you did a good job or not, if you don't document it and demonstrate it to them, you risk damaging your reputation with those granting agencies. And once you've started to damage that reputation, it's hard to come back. And the other thing is, all of these agencies talk to each other. So if you're sloppy on one project, probably other folks are going to hear about it. Do a good job.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Thanks, Steve, for these insights. And I mean, I'm sure you'll get a lot of connections through LinkedIn or emails or whatnot, because your success with STTC is one that I've never even heard of, in terms of, like, I wouldn't even touch that grant with a 10-foot pole. So super excited to meet someone who's successfully accessed it twice. And the work that you guys are doing, the BHAG that you guys have, or the big audacious goal of, you know, removing pesticides and harmful pesticides, is so important to the health of our current generation and future generations. So thank you so much for your time. If you're able to stay on a little bit, I would love to open things up to questions. So I'm actually just going to kind of skip this, because we've only got 10 minutes or 7 minutes left. And so I know Steve wants me to be relatively on time. So let's just go ahead and take questions. And I hope that, and even, like, you know, give us some feedback as well at the end of this presentation to tell us, like, did you learn something, even 1 or 2 golden nuggets that you can then take, and does this kind of move your organization a little bit more forward when it comes to grants? Any questions from the group? Probably through the group chat is easiest, so we don't have everyone speaking at once. This is your chance. Like, Steve is not an unbusy guy, so he needs to, you know, if you have a question about STTC, which I encourage, or any other programs, you know, but let's open the floor for you guys.
I mean, Stephanie, I would almost rather stay on that slide of Steve, all the money that non-dilutive funding. That's just great. And guys, you know, Babe Ruth has showed up for batting practice to help you guys out. He's raised, you know, $7 million in funding from a number of different agencies, you know, provincial, federal. You know, it's a great testament to the work that it takes that goes into it. But, you know, the results are obviously there. And so,
oh, here we go. what software are you using for your machine learning? SES, neural network, etc.
So we do use neural networks. The software that we're developing is largely developed in-house. We have a tremendous engineering team, but it's also being developed in collaboration with our collaborators at Simon Fraser University. And so, in terms of how we actually run our machine learning projects, we use a lot of the usual sort of standard tools that you might expect, TensorFlow, et cetera. But the software itself is largely custom because the questions that we're asking are fairly unique.
Okay.
Other presentations will be available.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
The presentations will be available from Stephanie and from you, Steve.
Yes, absolutely. So this recording will be made available, and if you'd like Stephanie's slides, we can also share those with you, for sure. There's a question from Christine. How much concurrent funding do you find is possible, such as IRAP, they have a few projects on different technologies, and can it be a matter of waiting for one grant to end before they consider another, or can you get a bunch of projects going at the same time?
Yeah, so this is why you see such a wide variety of sources of funding. Some like IRAP, you can have concurrent projects, but they really want to know that the next one doesn't start until the previous one is largely winding down. And so we actually spend a fair amount of time carefully looking at the openings from the various funding sources and our current portfolio. When will those be coming off? And kind of balancing all of these things. And if you look at the dates on there, you'll see a couple of the big ones are having somewhat different dates, but a lot of them are concurrent, and the concurrent ones largely are reinforcing other work that's going on. So as I mentioned, the Innovate BC is reinforcing the work that we're doing on the supercluster. And so when they're truly concurrent, it's usually multiple different funding sources that are supporting the same core objectives. And then we're always looking for when is that going to come off, and when are we going to look for the next, we want to have the next round of funding written, hopefully approved and funded in place. So as one winds down, the next one comes up. So it's sort of an orchestration process that's largely run by Natalie Glavis on my team. She's constantly looking at this. She's a PhD biochemist and a grant writer, and helps us manage much of these programs.
I'm going to add to that as well. So in terms of concurrent on the research side of things, that absolutely is what I would also say as well. I think on the other grant side of things, a lot of the grants are concurrent. So you could have a couple of hiring grants going at the same time as a couple of training grants, but you know that they kind of sit within a certain bucket. One thing I would be careful of is like IRAP and stackability with SHRED, for instance. There's some rules and regulations around that. Right. So, making sure that you're not, we're going to use the word double dipping, but you don't go after, say, for example, SDTC for the same project as what you would go after superclusters for. So that part of it could be a little bit sticky if you are like, it's kind of the same project. Just make sure you go after the right bucket for the right, to match it to the right funding. Yeah, that's my comment on that.
So there's a question. There's a question from Hussein, tips for tracking seed funding. I'm going to use that as a segue into, we do have a couple more webinars in this Restart and Resiliency series. Coming up next is pitching your business. So pitching for investment, pitching for sales. You're always pitching. Linda Plano is a wonderful resource to have, and she'll be talking about that on September 23rd. And then on the 30th, we will have, September 24th with Linda Plano, and on the September 30th, we will have Shannon Koskinen talking about fundraising. So I will leave Hussein's question about attracting seed funding for our fundraising section. There is a question from Arvin about grants for early stages of development, so TRL 1 to 3. So quite early. I mean,
Stephanie, do you want to take that one?
I mean, I'm going to say that in terms of research, I would, say IRAP and SHRED are things that absolutely you could leverage. But in terms of hiring, there's a ton of green jobs or clean tech types of programs that you can bring staff members on. You could work with MyTax. You could, get some co-op grant funding as well to support maybe students. Because when you're early stage like that, every dollar counts, right? So if you can get 75% of someone's wages covered, or, stack a provincial grant with a federal grant, get 100% of their wages covered, even though you don't have CEWS, you're making more than what CEWS is available for most other businesses. So those are kind of the ones that I would point to. And then Steve, if there's
so I have another thing I'll mention, which is that I'll give you a quick example on this on the supercluster biochemistry platform. We have a very small Vancouver company associated with that. And they were probably at that TRL 1-2 stage when we came in, and they do data compression, and we wanted somebody to help us compress all of those all those images that we were collecting. And they were able to join with us on a project, even though their piece of the technology was at a much lower readiness level. By becoming a partner with a company that had technology at a higher readiness level, you can become you can get funded to do that work if it fits in. So look for partners that need what you're developing, and get onto a project with them if it's something that requires a higher tech readiness level, and you can do that. Now, in fact, the digital supercluster, and actually the other superclusters, we haven't even talked about them, but they're also funding. They're way more interested in the innovation than the current tech readiness level. They want to know what it is, and they want to know that you have thought it out and you've got a path forward. But it's not required that you be at readiness level 5 or whatever. So there are options out there, but partnering is a great way to do it.
I'm going to add a comment on partnering, and it's not just on the industry and for-profit or university level. It could also be nonprofit. So if you work with a nonprofit organization or know of one that maybe their mandate is really linked to the technology that you're developing, nonprofit organizations and charities will be able to access different pockets of funding that you would be able to access. So they could write you in, similar to what Steve is saying, as a partner, and then you get compensated for your contribution to that project. And so that's, usually nonprofits don't have the technology acumen that's in-house, and so they often will partner with other organizations as well. So that's a sidebar on that, but there's a lot of these nonprofit organizations specifically supporting clean tech now.
Okay, awesome. So I wanted to say from Foresight and on behalf of the attendees, thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you so much for coming out, Stephanie, sharing some of the tips and best practices and some of the programs that people should definitely be looking at accessing, and generally how to do it well. And Steve, for your time today to share some of what has obviously worked very successfully. And again, I think the term, Stephanie, earlier was capital efficiency, right? Where you're leveraging government dollars and being capital efficient and showing your investors or potential investors that you're wise with your dollars. If you're going out and getting granting money, if you're putting the work in there, they're probably going to safer bet that you're going to be frugal with the dollars of theirs that you're going to use, right? So that does form a key part of your storytelling in that. And so we encourage people to look seriously at it because Canada has lots of great grants. So with that, I will let you guys go. I know it's a few minutes after time, and I'm sure lots of people are late for their next Zoom meeting already. But we, again, do have a couple more sessions coming up in this webinar series, and we will have a survey coming out with how we can support all of you and what areas you need to support early next week. So whether it's around grant writing, if there's current grants that you're struggling with getting out the applications for, or if it's other areas that we've covered through this Restart and Resiliency program, we'd love to see how we can support your companies to get the help you need in what is certainly a challenging time.
Awesome.
With that,
thank you.
I'll let you all go.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.